In Marble Halls, a celebration of music by Michael William Balfe. Presented by Marion Marshall, with T.P. McKenna as the composer.
A sound that evokes Victorian England. I dreamt I dwelt in marble halls by Michael William Balfe. 100 years ago, that tune was so popular, a sheet music copy could be found in every parlour. Many of us know the song, but what about its composer? Balfe, an unashamed sentimentalist, was once hailed as the greatest opera composer in Britain. Yet today he's little more than a footnote in the musical history books. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to discover more about Balfe and his music, why Johann Strauss described him as the king of melody, and George Bernard Shaw compared his music to Tchaikovsky's. But nobody could accuse Balfe of being highbrow. Even Laurel and Hardy produced a feature-length spoof of his opera, The Bohemian Girl, while artists from Fats Waller to Enya have recorded his songs. Our story starts in Pitt Street, Dublin, where Michael William was born in 1808. We know very little about Balfe's early years, except that he was a child prodigy. Aged only 8, he played at Dublin's Royal Exchange, as advertised in Saunders' newsletter.
After which, by most particular desire, and positively for that night only, that wonderful child, Master Balfe, will perform a concerto on the violin, in which he will introduce the popular air of the Minstrel Boy, and a rondo, composed expressly for this occasion by Mr. O'Rourke.
Alfredo Campoli and Killarney. The young Balfe was championed by Dublin society. He was even presented with a carriage and 2 goats by one admirer of his musical talents. At 14, Balfe was keen to seek his fortune in London. He approached the singer Charles Edward Horne, who was just finishing a concert tour of Ireland. Horne, the composer of Cherry Ripe and other popular ballads of the time, decided to take the young Balfe under his wing and complete his musical education in England. Miraculously, within a few days of Balfe's arrival in London, he found work as a violinist at Drury Lane, one of the great London theatres. Even today you can find Balfe's statue in the foyer of the Theatre Royal. But his debut there, as a concert artist in March 1823, received a less than ecstatic review in the Harmonicon.
On the 19th, an adventurous violinist from the sister isle named Balfe made his debut. He certainly possessed that noble daring for which his countrymen are remarkable, but we cannot say that his exploits excited our admiration, although they created surprise. He has youth, however, to plead in his excuse, and may, with proper attention, become a tolerable performer.
Balfe soon added another string to his bow, taking singing lessons with Horne. Before long, he had developed a fine baritone voice. Weber's opera Der Freischütz was a huge hit across Europe at the time, and a performance at the Norwich Theatre provided Balfe with his first public engagement as a singer. Sadly, the young Balfe died on stage, suffering from stage fright. And according to contemporary reports, in the Wolf's Glen scene, the onstage pyrotechnics were so realistic that the audience stampeded out of the theatre in panic. After these early setbacks, Balfe must have wondered if the proverbial luck of the Irish had deserted him. Just when he was losing heart, a fairy godfather appeared in the form of a wealthy Italian backer, the Count Mazzara. Mazzara, impressed with his musical talent and doubtless his considerable wit and charm, persuaded Balfe to return with him to Rome, where he could continue his studies with the great Italian musicians of the day, all expenses paid. How could he refuse? Balfe travelled with the Count to his palace and was duly introduced to the composer Cherubini. Balfe cherished ambitions to sing at La Scala, and Cherubini obligingly stepped in, arranging a dinner at his home with the great Italian maestro Rossini and his wife. After dinner, he was invited to sing. Rossini was so impressed with Balfe's performance that night, he promised to do everything in his power to obtain for him a position as a principal in a major opera house. The evening marked not only a milestone in Balfe's career, but also the beginning of a friendship that lasted over 40 years. Many years later, on his last visit to London, Rossini greeted his old friend, declaring, "It's true what they say, Balfe, you and I, we are melody." But within 12 months, Rossini was dead, a victim of the cold winter of 1868. His friend took the news very badly.
When I read the death of Rossini, I wept and sobbed. Alas, alas, the dear, the great Rossini gone, and I cannot come over to pay him the last tribute of respect. But I dare not face the cold winds. The exposure to the damp air would be my death.
Balfe knew he owed much of his early success to Rossini. Rossini had introduced him to the celebrated soprano Maria Malibran, who starred in one of Balfe's early operas, The Maid of Artois. In his memoirs, Alfred Bunn, manager of the Drury Lane Theatre, recalls the opening night.
I went into her dressing room previous to the commencement of the third act to ask how she felt, and she replied, "Very tired, but—" And here her eye of fire suddenly lighted up. "You angry devil, if you will contrive to get me a pint of porter in the desert scene, you shall have an encore to your finale." Had I been dealing with any other performer, I should perhaps have hesitated, but to check her powers was to annihilate them. I therefore arranged that behind the pile of drifted sand on which he falls in a state of exhaustion towards the end of the desert scene, a small aperture should be made in the stage, and through that aperture a pewter pint of porter was conveyed to the parched lips of this child of song. This so tickled her fancy that it was arranged during the subsequent run of the opera for the slave to have in the gourd suspended round his neck the same quantity of the same beverage to be applied to her lips.
In the early 1830s, Balfe's fame began to spread throughout France and Italy. He sang in Don Giovanni, The Thieving Magpie, and many other operas, whilst continuing to study composition with Cherubini and Rossini. Around this time, Balfe married the Hungarian singer Lina Rosa. After a highly successful Italian tour, the newlyweds returned to Britain, where Balfe began in earnest his career as a composer of English opera. When Balfe returned to London, he found a thriving musical scene. Regular concerts were given by music clubs, choral groups and orchestras. Like the pop stars of today, world-class performers would visit London, packing concert halls and commanding huge fees. Balfe's first hit, The Siege of Rochelle, was written for the reopening of the English Opera House in 1834. But the production ran into difficulties, and the opera was finally staged at Drury Lane. For his efforts, Balfe received the princely sum of £5 per night.
It was a glorious night, the first night of the Siege of Rochelle. One to wish your whole life long. The cram there was, the fashion, the delicious music, the enthusiastic applause, the double encores. Never had I witnessed anything like it. So carried away were even persons of the highest consequence by the enthusiasm created by this beautiful music, that people bent over and nearly threw themselves from the side boxes to congratulate and shake hands with the young composer. They crowned him with a wreath of flowers, and I question, amid all the numerous and great successes of this great artist, if he ever felt such a delighted heart as on the first night of the Siege of Rochelle.
So wrote Edward Fitzball, who had adapted the story to the Siege of Rochelle and was to collaborate with Balfe on many other projects. The opera became a particular favourite of Queen Victoria, who, encouraged by her husband Prince Albert, had begun to take an interest in opera. Balfe was by now the toast of London, a jovial character who found himself in constant demand as a concert singer, conductor and guest in the most fashionable salons. But his first love was writing music, and at the end of the day he would closet himself with a bottle or two of good claret and set to work on melodies for the great stages of London, Paris and Milan. That aria came from a dramatic scene entitled Il Degonda nel carcere, sung there by Huguette Tourangeau. By now, Balfe had become the Andrew Lloyd Webber of his day. Everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. After the siege of Rochelle came a stream of successes. Balfe's music was on everyone's lips, as he discovered one night on the way to a dinner party.
It was but a short distance to travel, but having very thin boots and the streets being rather muddy, I decided to take a cab. Now, the fare for a cab is only 6pence a mile, and on arriving at my destination, I handed the cabby a shilling, saying, "You must give me 6pence change, as the distance has been so short." To which the cabby replied, "I think, sir, I heard you sing a song called 'Oh no, we never mention her.'" "Yes, yes," I said, "I have sung it often." "Well then, sir," said cabby, "do you recollect a line in it? 'You'll find no change in me.'" I so enjoyed the cabby's wit that, of course, I gave him the additional 6pence.
Artistic and financial success fired Balfe with enthusiasm for a new project. He planned to form an English opera company to showcase the talents of leading British composers, himself included. His latest opera, Ceolanthe, opened at the Lyceum in March 1841. But on the first night, there was a rather disturbing incident.
Balfe was astounded at hearing from one of the chorus that Mr. Leffler, one of the principals, was in the coffee-room of a public house at the corner of York Road and Waterloo Road. And at 7:15, a special messenger was dispatched to Mr. Leffler, whom he found in a disgraceful state of beer. When asked if it was his intention to come to the theatre, he emphatically said, "No," and wrote the following extraordinary poetic effusion. "Dear Balfe, I am sorry to declare it. I have drunk too much claret. I can't sing tonight. Oh, damn it. Yours truly, Adam Leffler." Before the curtain rose, Mr. Balfe appeared on stage and read the above letter to the audience, who were amused considerably. Balfe left the stage to cries of laughter and shouts of "beer" and "heavy wet." The audience were well aware of Mr. Leffler's imbibing propensities, and the name of his favourite beverage, Dog's Nose, which I believe is a mixture of porter and gin.
After a few teething troubles, Ceolanthe ran successfully for 2 months. Then a row about money led to a walkout by cast and crew, as Alfred Bunn recalled with glee.
Without wishing my friend otherwise than well, I could not help smiling when I heard of an affliction visited on him a month or 2 afterwards during his management of the English Opera House. On the night of his own benefit, the curtain was unusually late in its ascent, and when Balfe came forward and told the audience that some malicious person had taken the handle that was to wind up the said curtain, he might have more truly said the carpenters were making a handle of him by refusing to take it up until some trifling arrear had been paid.
The effort of holding his fledgling opera company together eventually proved too much for Balfe. When the ill-fated Ceolanthe closed, he was forced to abandon his bold experiment. It wasn't simply the loss of money that irked Balfe. He had staked his by then considerable reputation in asking noble patrons like Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to sponsor the project. To take his mind off his problems and to restore his finances, he began to write ballads for London's music publishers.
And call the cattle home, and call the cattle home, across the sands of Dee. The western wind was wild and dank with foam, and all alone went western tide crept up along the sand, and o'er the sand, and round the sand, as far as I could see. hair, a drowned maiden's hair, above the nets at sea. But still the boatmen hear her call the cattle home across the sands of Dee, across the sands of Dee.
The Sands of Dee, sung by baritone Peter Allenson. Disheartened by his experiences in London, Balfe decided to try his luck in Paris. Before long, he was introduced to Eugène Scribe, a librettist who had worked with Rossini and many others. Together they worked on a comic opera called Le Puits d'Amour, or The Well of Love. It's Balfe at his best, pushing the soloists to the limit. The stunning vocal gymnastics of Sumi Jo in Dreams of Love and Glory from Le Puits d'Amour, which triumphed in Paris in 1843. Encouraged by this, Balfe returned to London to stage what was to become the most famous British opera of the 19th century, The Bohemian Girl. In next week's programme, we discover the secret of its success, uncover some of the theatrical superstitions surrounding this opera, and delve into some of the sharper practices of the London stage. But to play us out, here's Enya's ethereal version of I Dreamt I Dwelt in Marble Halls from The Bohemian Girl.
Vessels and serfs at which is all too great to count, and a high ancestral name. But I also dreamt, which pleased me most, that you loved me still the same, that you loved me still the same.
In Marble Halls was an Inflight production for Radio 2, presented by me, Marion Marshall, with readings by T.P. McKenna and Geoffrey Whitehead. It was written and produced by Robert Grange, with additional research by William Tyldesley.
In Marble Halls, the second of two programs about Michael William Balfe, presented by Marion Marshall, with T.P. McKenna as the composer.
On November the 27th, 1843, the most successful British opera of the 19th century received its first performance at Her Majesty's Theatre in London. The Bohemian Girl by Michael William Balfe quickly set new box office records and was performed over 100 times in its first year. The enduring popularity of the Bow Girl, as it was affectionately known, is due to the sentimental appeal of ballads like I Dreamt I Dwelt in Marble Halls, The Heart Bowed Down, and this one, When Other Lips.
The power they feel so well, there may perhaps in such a scene some recollection be of a day that was happy been, that you remember me, that you remember me.
The celebrated Beniamino Gigli. The Bohemian Girl captivated European audiences wherever it played. In Russia, the imperial family all came to hear it, while across the Atlantic it clocked up more performances than any other 19th century opera. Even George Bernard Shaw, whose reviews sometimes verged on the poisonous, said that the ballads in The Bohemian Girl were better than Tchaikovsky's, though he did say that Balfe, as far as he knew, never wrote a whole scene well. The Bohemian Girl was perhaps the high point of Balfe's prestigious career. Toward the end of his life, during rehearsals for a performance at the Théâtre Lyrique in Paris, he wrote,
"If God gives me another chance, I will gain a second and greater reputation. I am up early in the morning, revising, correcting, and re-instrumenting the Bohemian Girl, trying to perfect old ideas, giving the work the benefit of mature judgment. I intend to work very hard to retrieve much lost time."
Performances of the Bohemian Girl are rare today. It was last revived at Covent Garden by Sir Thomas Beecham in 1951. On that occasion, our friends in Radio 3 created something of a scandal by offering only 20 guineas for a live broadcast of a Saturday performance. And over the years it's popped up in some surprising places. Laurel and Hardy made their own full-length film version of the story, playing the parts of two hapless gypsies. The musical arrangers even adapted their famous theme tune to fit the score. And in 1940, the great Fats Waller recorded this version of When Other Lips. Fats Waller. The Bohemian Girl also became a favourite for touring opera companies and amateur groups. The old adage went, "When business is bad, give the Bohemian Girl and fill your purse." And a theatrical myth grew up, rather like that surrounding Shakespeare's Scottish play, that to sing "I dreamt I dwelt in marble halls" in a theatre would bring you bad luck. But for Michael William Balfe, the Bohemian Girl brought nothing but good luck, and a diary crammed with engagements for years to come. One of the great stars of the Parisian stage was the soprano Anna Tillon, whom Balfe was anxious to engage for his new French opera.
Madame Tillon had created a furore in her debut of Auber's The Crown's Diamonds, and everybody thought she would be engaged for the next season. But Mr. Maddox, lessee of the Princess's Theatre, had allowed her to leave London without re-engagement. Mr. Balfe had composed an opera which it was thought would exactly suit this charming cantatrice, and was commissioned by Mr. Bunn to go to Paris to form an engagement with her. Arriving in Boulogne by the early boat, by chance he met Mr. Maddox, who was enjoying the sea breezes there on the pier. On hearing of Balfe's mission, Mr. Maddox was inwardly chagrined, but made no mention of it. He invited Balfe to dine with him and two friends, and Balfe eventually consented to dine with the cunning, facetious manager. During dinner, Maddox said to Balfe in a very cavalier manner, "My dear Balfe, I'm called away for a few minutes on business of the greatest importance, but you can enjoy yourself with my friends during my absence." Of course, Maddox left the hotel and caught the first train to Paris. Balfe, on arriving at Paris, went immediately to the residence of Madame Anna Tillon in the Rue Saint-Georges, and when he told her of the purport of his visit, she laughed heartily, saying, "Cher maestro, you have been jockeyed, for Maddox was here at 11 o'clock this morning, and has engaged me for the Princess's Theatre for the whole of the next season."
Return to your friends, Anna Tillon, our heart's sweetest bird to beguile. Come back, and we'll greet you, bright artiste, in genuine, true Irish style.
I know a maiden fair to see. Take care, take care. She can both false and friendly be. Beware, beware. Trust her not. She gives a side glance and looks down. Beware, beware. Trust her not, she is fooling thee. She is fooling thee. And she has hair of a golden hue. And she has hair of a golden hue. And what she says, it is not true. And what she says, it is not true. Beware, beware, beware. Trust her not, trust her not, trust her not, trust her not. She is fooling thee. She is fooling thee. Trust her not. She is fooling thee. She is fooling thee. Beware, beware. Take care. Beware, beware. Trust her not. Trust her not. I know a maiden fair to see. Take care. She can both false and friendly be. Beware, beware. Trust her not. She is fooling thee. She is fooling thee.
Trust Her Not, sung by Felicity Lott and Anne Murray. 1851 was the year of Prince Albert's Great Exhibition. For the first time, the expanding rail network was making long journeys affordable for almost anyone with a taste for adventure, and Hyde Park was filled with people who had travelled far and wide to see the spectacle.
After a brilliant performance of the Muta di Portici, the curtain rose upon a well-devised scene of the monster Crystal Palace, the first of that illustrious species, and the surrounding landscape of Hyde Park. An occasional ode, composed by Balfe, the conductor, heralded the symbolical congress of peace and goodwill among nations.
Like the Great Exhibition, Balfe's music sent out a harmonious message. In Vienna, Johann Strauss hailed him as the king of melody, and in St. Petersburg he was welcomed once again by the royal family.
I have done splendidly here. The Russians have positively taken a fancy to me, and I have all the prettiest women in St. Petersburg as pupils. I shall come back here next season, of course. The Empress herself has had the goodness to request me to return. I really cannot speak in too high terms of all the imperial family. I am spoiled by them, and, what is almost better, have received splendid presents.
Returning from St. Petersburg, Balfe dropped in to visit his daughter Louise and son-in-law Max Behrendt at their home in Danzig. Whilst there, he composed 6 songs and a duet to words by the American poet Longfellow. They soon became bestsellers.
The shades of night were falling fast, as through an Alpine village passed a youth who bore mid snow and ice a banner with a strange device. Excelsior, Excelsior. His brow was sad, his eye beneath flashed like a falchion from its sheath, and like a silver clarion rang the accents of that unknown tongue. Excelsior, Excelsior. In happy homes he saw the light on household fires gleam warm and bright. Above the spectral glaciers shone, and from his lips escaped a groan. Excelsior, the tempest overhead. The roaring torrent is deep and wide, and loud that clarion voice replied. Excelsior! Excelsior!
Not difficult to understand why that was a Victorian favourite. Benjamin Luxon, Robert Tyr and Andre Previn were the performers. As a result of Balfe's settings, Longfellow's poetry became very popular. But it seems that by the end of the 1850s, Balfe had got himself into serious financial trouble. He owed music publishers Chappell and Beale £2,000, equivalent to about £100,000 today. Perhaps it's malicious to suggest that the rather hasty marriage of Balfe's younger daughter Victoire at this time was no coincidence. Her intended was the quaintly named Sir John Fiennes Twistleton Crampton, then ambassador in St. Petersburg. He was considerably older and richer than Victoire, and Balfe wasted no time in asking Sir John for help.
My dear Sir John, the Beale affair, having been brought to a termination, will, I trust, make you easier in your mind and enable you to enjoy your charming cottage and lake. I assure you, I felt so wretched that I was determined to do something to rescue as many hundreds as possible. I went off to Mrs. Beale, paid her a visit, never spoke word of the action, heard the daughter sing, offered lessons gratis, was accepted as benefactor, and installed the next day as honorary professor. The more she sang out of tune and time, the more I praised her voice to the mamma. I got to the soft side of the lady sooner than I expected, and after the lesson ventured to say how dreadful it was that her son should be so spiteful. Well, she listened, and gave vent to her feelings in the following words. My son is a blackguard and a wretch, capable of any rascality. My husband is a poor, weak fool, whom they will lead by the nose, and has not the courage to say a word beyond what they put in his mouth. I returned 2 days later, and Beale, with tears in his eyes, said to me, I will undertake to settle for £1,370. Jarman would not hear of it costing you more than 1,000. I offered my bill for £370, which he accepted, and so ends this horrible extortion.
It must have been the talk of London at the time, but wasn't mentioned in any contemporary account of Balfe's life, and has remained undiscovered until now. We get a good idea of what an ingenious character Balfe was. Victoire divorced Sir John 3 years later. Meanwhile, his relationship with another London publisher, Novello, was more amicable. In 1859, he was commissioned to edit a collection of Irish melodies, supplying introductions and accompaniments. It was a job he relished.
As mute on Tara's walls, as if their soul were fled, so sleeps the pride of former days, so glory's thrill is o'er, and hearts that once beat high for praise now feel that pulse no more. No more to chiefs and ladies bright the harp of Tara swells, the chord alone that breaks at night its tale of ruin tells. The spring
she gives is when some heart indignant breaks to show that still she lives.
The Harp That Once Through Tara's Halls, sung by the tenor John McCormack. In Balfe's day, the words to popular songs didn't come from the pens of professional lyricists. It was the custom to set to music works by the great poets. For example, there are literally hundreds of versions of Tennyson's Come Into the Garden, Maud, but it's Balfe's melody that has stood the test of time.
Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, I am here at the gate alone. I am here at the gate alone, and the woodbine spices are wafted abroad, and the musk of the roses blown, for a breeze of morning moves, and the planet of love is on high, beginning to faint in the light that she loves on a bed of daffodil sky, to faint in the light of the sun she loves, to faint in the light and to die. Come, come, come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, I am here at the gate alone. I am here at the gate alone. I am here at the gate alone.
Stuart Burroughs. Toward the end of the 1850s, two singers, Louisa Pyne and William Harrison, following in Balfe's footsteps, made another attempt to set up an English national opera at Covent Garden. Balfe agreed to write 3 new operas for the company. The operas ran in successive seasons, but sadly the third, The Armourer of Nantes, was to be the last work Balfe saw produced. The hectic pace of London life and his gruelling schedule of foreign travel had taken their toll. So Balfe decided to sell his house in London and bought Rowney Abbey in rural Hertfordshire. There he was able to enjoy the pleasures of country life, a little gentle farming, and time with his grandchildren. But taking it easy didn't always come naturally to Balfe. On a visit to his daughter Victoire, now remarried to a Spanish nobleman, he was indignant when a planned fishing trip was vetoed.
My dear O'Shea, the man whose signature is affixed to this letter is suffering under a smarting complaint. Poor fellow possesses a daughter who is a grandee of Spain, who so far forgot herself last night as to, I blush in being obliged to say it, call her affectionate male parent a donkey, merely because he said he was going to fish with Bill O'Shea. She refused to grant a vehicle of locomotion, even with one quadruped attached. What do you think of my paternal position? Under the circumstances, I think it better to reverse the order of things and obey my child. Alas, she fears her father would catch cold, and not fish. Hoping to see you in the course of the day, I remain your unhappy friend, M. W. Balfe.
Balfe lived happily and quietly for 2 more years. He had nearly completed his final opera, The Knight of the Leopard, when, in the autumn of 1870, he developed pneumonia. His condition deteriorated, and just after noon on the 20th of October 1870, Michael William Balfe passed away. With his death, an era in British music ended. Balfe had worked hard to establish a healthy and internationally renowned English opera. Throughout Europe and America, his music was known and adored. His operas compared to those of the Italian greats Rossini and Verdi. The tragedy was that there was no one talented enough to continue his work. A few years after Balfe's death, British opera had returned to the same sorry state he had found it in when he took London by storm with the Siege of Rochelle in 1835. Balfe's old friend and librettist Edward Fitzball summed it up perfectly in his memorial poem.
Dear sunny Balfe, and is he dead? And all the golden moments fled in which this joyous child of song glided life's sparkling stream along, and touched the chords of music's lyre with genial and poetic fire, so beautiful, sweet to hear, that kings bent down a listening ear, and nations wafted to the skies the fragrance of his melodies. Yes, he is gone, and many a day in music's span must pass away ere such another gifted hand, a light of other days, command or sanctify at fancy's call the fairy dreams of marble halls.
In Marble Halls was an Inflight production for Radio 2, presented by me, Marion Marshall, with readings by T.P. McKenna and Geoffrey Whitehead. It was written and produced by Robert Grange, with additional research by William Tyldesley.